Welcome to another episode of Phase-Space Invaders. It's the 29th conversation on the podcast, and my guest today is Jérôme Hénin, Research Director at CNRS in Paris at the Laboratory of Theoretical Biochemistry. Early in his career, Jérôme worked under Chris Schipper to develop the adaptive biasing force method, one of the main approaches in free energy calculations for biological systems, and has spent considerable time working on flavors, extensions, and implementations of ABF. He then worked on the COLVARS library that initially provided collective variable definitions and free energy methods for the NumD ecosystem, now also including a VMD plugin. But the interface has now been expanded to other simulation programs such as GROMACS or LAMMPS. In parallel, Jérôme did a lot of impactful applied work on both lipids themselves and transmembrane proteins. So Jérôme starts with the history of the ABF methods and its advantages compared to the main competitors, and connects it to the development of COLVARS, historically very parallel to how the development of the Plumed tool stemmed from the needs of the metadynamics community. We discussed the benefits of graphical interfaces in biomolecular workflows and touch upon the question of connecting multiple software environments and communities. We then move on to discuss membrane systems and the challenges they pose, both historically and today, and end up on the alchemical side, talking about the latest approaches to alchemical free energy calculations from several exciting angles. Eventually, we agree that regardless of software developments, it's learning and helping others learn to understand molecular systems that's the most rewarding part of the job of a biophysicist. So I think we're both equally happy to share this conversation with you, hoping you learn something new. Jérôme Hénin, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
So, Jérôme, your name already came up in our conversation with Lucy Delamotte a while back, where she cited you as one of the top experts on free energy methods and enhanced sampling. And myself, I grew up in a world that was dominated by two main approaches at the time. There's umbrella sampling, where we keep our system, restrained at various points and kind of extract and integrate local tendencies, and metadynamics, where we systematically kick the system out of its comfort zone to make it explore more diverse configurations. But your main contribution to the field revolves around the now multiple flavors of the adaptive biasing force algorithm, or ABF. And so what was the history behind it? What was the initial motivation to develop it? How does it fit in this grand landscape as of now?
So I think that's a very good way to look at the landscape. So first, ABF and metadynamics appeared roughly at the same time in 2001. But if you say that umbrella sampling localizes the collective variables somewhere and metadynamics just pushes them around, ABF takes a third way, which is let the variables evolve spontaneously, quote unquote, or diffuse. So preserve the diffusive behavior of these variables, but flatten the barriers along the way. So it's trying to, so this was designed by Andrew Pohoril, who was really a physicist and had a physicist approach. And so he was concerned with keeping equations of motion that behaved as much as possible as they would in the unbiased system. So there was kind of minimizing the perturbation. That was the idea. And so in ABF, you just let the system diffuse and have the same kind of stochastic dynamics, and very smoothly erase the free energy gradient along the way. So that's the basic idea. In terms of my own motivation was not very precise, because I was just a young grad student, and so I had no background in all that. But I was working with Chris Schipper at the time. He was the mentor. He did a postdoc with Andrew Pohoril, so he got exposed to the very early idea of ABF and offered me to work on this new exciting method at the time and implement it into NumD, which sounded like fun. So that's how I got started. And then I became a believer in the strength of this approach, and mostly the approach of working at the level of the free energy gradient. I think that's very powerful, because if you look at the free energy gradient, you can have a purely local estimate that's very significant. But if you try to estimate free energies, you need a non-local estimate to get something significant, because otherwise it's just up to a constant additive factor. So any information you get on the local free energy gradient is something that's gained for good, I guess, something you've learned about the system.
All right, that's a fair point and a good distinction between the methods. And then over the years, you built multiple flavors of ABF, right? So just as metadynamics, say, started evolving by incorporating kind of well-tempered multiple walkers, so did ABF. Can you summarize what are the most successful approaches that you would recommend, for example, or you would use today?
Yeah, so I think it went into several directions. One direction was to make it applicable to more systems and more types of coordinates, because the initial formulation was a bit demanding in terms of mathematics. So you needed to have essentially to compute the Jacobian derivative. So it was kind of based on second derivative calculations, and that was a bit heavy. And there were other formulations, but so that was one part of the work that led to working in this extended system variant. And then another part of the work really was to get better exploration behavior. And that has occupied Chris Schippo and his co-workers with all these combinations of ABF and different flavors of metadynamics, because metadynamics has this property of never getting stuck or being very good at getting out of pitfalls, I guess. Whereas ABF dynamics, if you have a slow relaxing orthogonal coordinate, then ABF is trying to estimate a local free energy gradient, but that local estimate is drifting slowly over time as things relax. And because the local, this estimate is drifting slowly, it's never really up to speed with what the coordinate is currently feeling. And so you get trapped. So that's the property of ABF that I think is kind of a double-edged sword, or maybe a blessing in disguise, because sure, your dynamics is getting trapped, but it's a very useful diagnosis. It tells you that your free energy estimate is somehow incorrect or slowly converging. So what I've always appreciated about ABF is that ABF will not give you confidently a bogus answer. Whereas, if you could say, if you run umbrella sampling always gives you an answer, and then you need to dig if you want to make sure that it's significant. So that's something that ABF, the quality of the answer is directly visible in the ABF dynamics. If the ABF dynamics is nicely diffusive and you get something more or less flat, then you know that your answer is correct.
Oh yeah, if you spend enough time on any simulations forum, you'll see quite a lot of unplausible PMFs that people get from umbrella sampling.
Absolutely.
That's definitely true. There's always something that's coming out. No, this kind of self-consistency is a nice property. I can see how that helps to know that you're not getting what you thought you were getting. And so, yeah, what are the common pitfalls that you already mentioned that, of course, getting stuck is one common problem, right? But especially when you go to the multidimensional aspect of it, right?
That's right.
We have a very simplified understanding of multidimensional free energies, I believe. And probably you can have a much more refined narrative about it you can share.
Yeah. So the assumption when you do one of these methods that enhance the dynamics in a low dimension space is that, so I guess you just start from the perspective of configuration sampling. The idea is that you have a very high dimension space, but the relevant areas, the regions of high probability are located in a low dimension submanifold. And so you're saying, okay, we can localize our simulations. Our simulation is going to evolve in this low dimension manifold. But then if you want your enhanced sampling dynamics to work well, that means that the dynamics has to be, you have to parameterize this low dimension manifold with coordinates that will also reproduce the dynamics well. So in other words, you need a good description, a good projected dynamics. So that's something that I got interested in recently, mostly talking to Fabio Pietrucci, whose work part of his work is fitting low dimension dynamical models, like low dimension Langevin equation, to the projected dynamics, to like collective variable dynamics from a high dimension simulation. And that's a tricky thing to do, but when it works, it's very rewarding, because then not only do you have a convincing, statistical model, but you have a convincing low dimension dynamical model. I think that's the ideal setting. So of course, that requires two things: that there is an effective, that the actual dynamics is actually well described in a low dimension space, and that you can find that space and parameterize it properly. So that opens the whole Pandora's box of collective variable discovery, which is a field in itself. Mm-hmm. And it's funny because many people work in that field, and there is, it's a huge literature. And I haven't done a lot of work myself, and I tend to work like downstream from that. Like once you have collective variables, then I provide tools to work with them. Just because there is so much work, I'm not sure in what way I could contribute at this point, and everybody has to find their own little niche.
Right. Because we often just look at the system and we think we know what the collective variable should be, right? Okay, we take at this distance that's changing. Mm-hmm. But then, I've been in this situation so many times where you think you're simulating something, and then you look at the simulation and you realize, okay, the simulation is clearly doing something that I didn't expect, right? Because
absolutely,
you find yourself in a very different region of the phase space or the configuration space that you were imagining in your head. So how close are we to like automating or maybe improving these things in a robust way?
Yeah, right. My first question would be like, how much do we want to automate them? I think this first step where you say like, I think this distance must be changing, it's an important step. And I think it means that, that there is a scientist somewhere looking at the system and developing ideas and, mental models of what's happening. So I like that. And that's what I talked about in this paper from a couple of years ago, whose title is like human learning of collective variables, something like that. That's as opposed to machine learning. So I think we need humans to learn. Otherwise, I'm not sure what we're useful for. So in this case, okay, you have an idea about some collective variables, you run a simulation, and then something happens that you didn't expect. To me, that's good news, right? When something happens you didn't expect, it means you're learning something. That's the kind of the point. But of course, there's a tedious process then of adjusting your computational model with what you've learned, and then running again, maybe learning something new and everything. And so the whole iterative loop of refining your collective variable choice and running more simulations is exactly what I wanted to streamline when I started working on this VMD plugin, this COLVARS dashboard, which is all about working with the data set that you have and exploring freely, but manually the space of collective variables to extract maximum insight from it, and then refine your own low dimension model of what's happening.
Right. We can talk about COLVARS a little bit, because this is something, as you mentioned before, that is kind of parallel to Plumed and serves a very similar purpose, right? And you say it was again developed roughly at the same time, and is now the default free energy plugin for NumD, right? But also has been recently implemented in GROMACS. And what else?
Also labs.
Other codes.
So labs is very good because it's really used in different communities of materials, like soft matter. So that really gives people from different communities access to those algorithms. And then recently TinkerHP, which implements in particular some polarizable force fields really well. So that's, again, that kind of extends the type of applications you can do with these methods. So the spirit of COLVARS, and as Plume really was to remedy a situation that was before, which was different codes implemented different methods. And for each method, like collective variable based methods, they implemented some collective variables. And so you had this very, very fragmented ecosystem where, given the molecular dynamics engine you wanted to use, you had some methods available. And for each method, you had some choice of collective variables, but all of that was extremely limited. And so the idea was to make that extremely modular, just defining variables on one side and different biasing algorithms on another, and possibly having a flexible interface so these codes could be interfaced with different MD engines. And that's what's achieved by these codes.
No, these are definitely great developments. I had Max Bonomi before. We talked about how Plumed contributes to that goal, and it's also great that you can move in the other part of the space of molecular engines, right? Like NAMD and a few others, and everything can be just plug and play in a way. I also told you before, but I want to credit COLVARS dashboard with inspiring me to, believe that you can actually write a plugin into VMD that could be useful. So yeah, I'm really, really happy that it's out. And yeah, actually, I wanted to mention this kind of utility of graphical interfaces in what we do, right? Because many of us are people who work with the command line. We are so used to doing things the hard way. And that's probably a very convenient tool for people who are really, really well taught or have a lot of experience with command line tools, right? How do we make things easier, though, for us by integrating visualization and by using those tools like VMD to exactly making sure that things are visual and accessible?
Yeah, I think that goes beyond. It's true that it's having a visual interface or a graphical interface makes it more accessible to people with, essentially, it gives her a smoother learning curve. It makes it more accessible to more people. But sometimes, even with, no matter how experienced you are, some tasks are just easier in an interactive way, in a graphical way. So the reason I started working on this COLVARS dashboard is that I had been dreaming of a tool that would, I was getting tired of doing these things manually. And so I wanted shortcuts, and those shortcuts took the form of a graphical interface I imagined. And at some point I got tired of waiting for someone to write it, and I sat down and wrote it. And I was really surprised because I wrote the first prototype that was maybe 200 lines of code. I still have it lying around somewhere. And these 200 lines of code were just one little window with a few buttons. And it immediately became useful to me on a day-to-day basis. And so I loved it, and I just kept improving it and extending it until I wanted to unleash it upon the world. And that's where it becomes really interesting, because once you distribute it, so that's another thing in my work, is that I like to write code that is as widely distributed as possible and to get as much feedback from users as possible, because I noticed that I do much better work when I'm connected with people who use it for real stuff. And sometimes I write code and end up many years later realizing that the interface I designed, sounded good in my head, but really it's not helping people, or it's not at all the best solution. But because I've done something in a disconnected way from users, then it's very suboptimal. So I try to be as connected as possible. That's one thing I learned, that to avoid doing too much work on my own, without talking to users.
Oh yeah, that's great advice. I have been working with Barry and Diego from the VMD side, and having their feedback on what they consider good practices and what users want and how streamlined things should be was a huge change from my own mentality there. So I can definitely recognize this contribution of people who are routinely working with those tools and are connecting with users and, know the user experience side. There's this common question, I think, and I've been talking about it recently, about, when do you want to start writing your own software versus contributing to someone else's software? And yeah, I think it's a kind of timely question, because there are so many packages now that you can contribute to, but then sometimes you want more control over something. I think you struck a right balance where you have a module that is a part of a bigger package, right? And in this way, you have a lot of control over the module that is still useful to people who make it popular and distribute it. And in this way, it really has the best of the two worlds.
Yeah, that's right. And there was really getting our library and module integrated into GROMACS was a very interesting experience, and honestly a kind of difficult one, because GROMACS is this recently they've raised their software engineering standards quite a lot. And so they have a lot of demands, they have a well thought out reviewing process and testing process and everything. And so getting code into GROMACS, one does not simply send code into GROMACS. And when you had, we already had this well-developed library, pretty large, and dealing with a lot of constraints from other packages we interact with. And having input, interacting with VMD, VMD was at the time limited. We had to use pretty old compilers and old language standards, so we could not use the more modern stuff. But GROMACS pretty much demanded the more modern stuff. And so we had to strike compromise and we had to negotiate a lot of stuff with GROMACS developers. Mostly, fortunately, we had to do a lot of work on the interface, but the library was well separated enough that it was our own turf. And so what happens in the library is basically of no concern because it doesn't contaminate GROMACS code base. So yeah, it was convenient to have that. Even the interface gave us a lot of work. It took several years to get it smooth.
I see. I still haven't tested it in GROMACS, but big shout out to those guys because I've been to one of those writing code in GROMACS tutorials, and they really put a lot of effort into streamlining the standards and making them modern and kind of explicit. So as you say, now we can just take all the standards and start writing code for them. But it's still a lot of review, a lot of
and even though they've modernized things, they still have, the code still has a long history, and so there is a lot of legacy codes and design in there. And so, it is very complex. All of these major packages are very complex, so it takes a lot of time to get used to them.
Oh yeah, very often people ask me like, "Oh, do you write your code for simulations?" And like, you don't know, people who are outside of science and just hear that, "Oh, I simulate things." Do you write that in Python? And I'm like, that would be. You could write something that runs in Python, but that's not going to be competitive with anything.
Sure.
Yeah, so a lot of the work you've done also was driven by the requirements of the biological systems, right? And for you, these were mostly membrane systems where you have this really slow lateral diffusion. And of course, you want to enhance the sampling of certain things, binding and binding. What were the best or most interesting takeaways that you could explore there?
Yeah, so that landscape has changed a lot. When I started as a grad student, the challenges were immense. So as you said, the systems were slow. So the sampling challenges were just, we had a big membrane protein and explicit lipids and stuff, and we ran a handful of nanoseconds and hoped that something would happen. And it did happen, and we did get, some insight on some local processes, but then the modeling challenges were huge. The force fields were not that great, especially lipid force fields. And the thing with lipid bilayers is that they're these exquisitely sensitive systems, like mechanically sensitive, because a bilayer exists as a balance of lateral forces, and you have very strong repulsion forces and attraction forces. So if you look at the pressure profile, you have like positive pressure and negative pressure, and the balance between these positive and negative pressures gives you a certain area per lipid, and certain bilayer structure. And that is not just like a random, unimportant parameter, because if you change this balance, you might go into a gel phase. So you might get completely different overall behavior. So to get that balance right, you need to get this very large positive number and very large negative number exactly right, because a very small relative error will give you completely broken bilayers. So when I was a grad student, lipid models were a big deal. And I started pretty early on working with the CHARM family of, lipid force fields, which were and are still like spearheaded by Rich Pastor at NIH. And Rich pretty much spent his life making lipid models, and that's a level of dedication that's amazing. And I think that has paid, because I think the CHARM lipid models they're the best out there in my view. And back then, some lipid models were quite bad. And even the CHARM force fields didn't have exactly the right area per lipid, so you had to tweak them. But, they took the very difficult decision of making like ground up models, like using this strong fragment based approach. So basically the models were not explicitly tuned to get the right area per lipid. They were tuned to get proper molecular properties, and then they were hoping that they would turn out to have the right area per lipid because the physics would be right. And that was extremely difficult. And most other force fields just tweak the parameters until they got the area per lipid right. But of course, the physics was otherwise quite wrong. So anyway, so nowadays we have incredible lipid models, and we can simulate them for a long time. So that's cool. And then the last part of the puzzle was the membrane proteins, because of course, to do membrane protein simulations, you need membrane protein structures. And back then they were few and far between. So a very common sport in membrane protein simulation was doing homology models of everything, right? Everything had to be homology model based on something more or less related. Sometimes it was very, very hazardous. And
they would fall apart beautifully.
Yeah, it may, or sometimes they didn't. And that was incredible. And I had, honestly, I'm quite amazed at how well homology models have held up, in that area. We've done some very sensible things based on homology models, even though some people in the field just did not believe homology models and, never had, especially a lot of structural biologists. So that was a time when there were two kinds of experimental biologists. Some of them would not believe anything that came from modeling or simulation, and others who were believers and believed everything that came out of simulations, which was way too much trust to put on us. So I think by now, the field has matured a whole lot, and people who do, anyone who works with molecules has a much better grasp of what simulations can do. So.
Yeah, but we have to say that very often those transmembrane regions were actually the most conserved in terms of evolution, right? So maybe it wasn't ridiculous, or not even conserved, but conserved in mechanical terms or in terms of the general structure. So
that's right, because the sequences were a bit more degenerate because you have a smaller vocabulary of amino acids or more hydrophobics and stuff. Mm-hmm. So on the sequence level, you would have not much sequence conservation, but you're right that the folds were pretty well conserved. So that was probably what saved us back then. That's true. And I've seen, but in some occasions, there were some really unfair processes at work. So I've seen people painstakingly come up with with homology models that looked pretty reasonable and try to publish them and have them, rejected by fancy journals. But then just after that, X-ray crystal structures came out. And as long as you had just modeling predictions, people would ignore them because they were just from modeling. And as soon as they were confirmed by experiments, people would ignore the predictions because we had the experimental result. And so it was like a lose-lose situation that could be unpleasant at times.
Yeah, I see. I think the CASP was already running at the time, I guess, right? But unless you make it somehow formalized, that you make a prediction and you make a bet.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's really hard to formalize in this kind of haphazard way.
And even if you evaluate formally, biologists are not going to be interested. They were not interested in the prediction and before it was validated, and they were not interested in it after it was validated either because they had their experimental result. So.
Right.
And you cannot you might be able to argue to command people's agreement based on very well formulated scientific reasoning, but you cannot command their interest. Yes. And at some point it becomes just an emotional issue or something, or not rational.
I think it's fair to say that there was a time where we were not really in the predictive regime, right? Where we probably had a coin flip chance of being right or wrong.
We were teetering on the edge of prediction.
Yes. Yeah. So probably this is an attitude that people have to change now because now we're doing, I guess, much better as a community. Mm-hmm. And some people are still catching up to that, as I see, talking to experimentalists. But they have their reasons and they might not be the worst reasons.
But I remember a talk I gave about 6 or 7 years ago, maybe, about ligand-gated ion channels, which is a family of proteins I did a lot of work on. And basically that talk, it was for a mixed audience of experimental and computational researchers. And most of the talk was explaining what we predicted and how it turned out to be confirmed by experiments, and then how we predicted something else, which again turned out to be confirmed. It was just a series of those things, trying to hammer home the message that, yes, we could predict stuff. And also that maybe, trying to claim a bit more credit than we were given at the time.
Yeah, I think the best research from our community was always somehow predictive, but there is such a mixture of quality and people collaborating at different levels that I guess the effective message might have been different.
Yeah, that's true.
Then going back a bit to the ABF, but also the ligands that you mentioned, how about the alchemical side, right? Because now you mentioned that you're kind of converging on enhanced sampling and also alchemical simulations. For those of the listeners who don't know, it's simulations where you essentially morph one molecule into another by creating or destroying dummy atoms and making this unphysical transformation, right? So now this so-called lambda coordinate for you is just another coordinate that you can sample dynamically in simulation.
That's right. And in our case, in most applications, we're not even morphing a molecule into another, but we're morphing it into nothing, because we use it mostly for absolute binding free energy calculations. So really computing the free energy difference between a molecule interacting with an environment and the same molecule not interacting with it. So to get a binding free energy of a ligand to a macromolecule like a protein, you want to decouple it from the binding site and then decouple it separately from like bulk solvent. And that comparing these two free energies gives you essentially the binding free energy. So yeah, that's a very old method. It's interesting. The first paper that really does this is from 1986. And it's really literally affinity of a small molecule, really, that was an inert gas. I think it was Xeon atom to a protein site. But so it's almost as old as protein simulations, not quite, but nearly as old. And I read that paper again just a couple of years ago.
Was it by?
I'm trying to remember the name.
It wasn't Swansea.
No, it wasn't Swansea. It was, it's very confusing because it's by this Indian scientist who published some papers with, at some point there was a mix up between the first and last name. And so some papers have his first name as author name and the others have it. So basically he has papers with under two different names. So Shankar is one of his names, whatever it is.
Okay. I'm going to find it.
Yeah. Anyway, that's pretty amazing because in that paper, there is a discussion of many issues that reappeared like a decade later or even 2 decades later, and that people kept arguing. But really, that guy had a pretty solid idea of how the whole thing worked, even back then at the very beginning. So yeah, so sometimes we think we're doing something new, and then we're just not aware of all the old literature that's out there.
Oh yes, and how predictive are we there now? Because I remember we always struggle to break the, say, 1 kcal per mole barrier, right? Which is considered say, chemical accuracy or...
And that's interesting because so there's two branches to that question. One of them is how well do these free energy methods work and how well can we sample? So how low can we get the statistical error bars or the variance of our estimation? And then the second branch is what is the bias of our estimation, which is the bias of our model. So the force field mostly, but not just the force field, maybe the other things that are like...
The binding poles?
Yeah, I mean, the binding poles...
Water molecules, yeah.
In principle, all of that falls under the sampling part. If we had, proper infinite sampling, if the binding pose... So that depends if you call the binding pose just a starting point or something you use to define the binding site that you're characterizing. So recently we've moved on. So that's something, the whole binding affinity prediction work is something I've mostly collaborated on with Grace Brannigan at Rutgers, Camden. And with Grace, we have this framework that we call SAFEP, Streamlined Alchemical Free Energy Perturbation. And in that, really, it starts with characterizing a bound state ensemble. So the idea is you need a statistical definition of the bound state. So first you need definition of the bound state to begin with, because it makes no sense to try and quantify something that you haven't defined first in a quantitative manner. So really it all begins with running a simulation of the complex you want to characterize, just a plain MD, unbiased simulation to see how the complex behaves. Sometimes, depending on your choice of modeling parameters, force fields and stuff, the ligand might just run away immediately, in which case maybe there's no point in trying to estimate the binding free energy. So, and that really goes back to a very general principle that I really like. I forgot who told me that first. That was many years ago. And basically it is like, the less you know about a given system, the less complex the methods you should be using on it. So, if you don't know anything about your system, start with just plain MD. Don't try to do fancy stuff, because you don't know, you have no idea what's going to happen, and you will be unable to interpret what's happening.
Yeah.
If you do fancy stuff, it can go wrong in so many ways. So do the simple stuff, get a rough idea, like qualitative idea, and then you can move on to more fancy things, right? Fancy methods and sampling and whatnot. So I really like that idea. And I think that makes sense to not try and quantify anything for a system that you don't understand qualitatively. And so again, we go back to the human learning part. And that's why I'm it's interesting. I wouldn't say I'm skeptical, but you have papers in the ligand binding for energy prediction literature there's a lot of high throughput papers or, papers that characterize large data sets. And so you have, many binding sites or many ligands, and you get big tables with a lot of figures. And I have nothing to say. I have nothing against those papers on a technical level. I think they can be really well done and have some pretty solid statistics. But on the purely, again, like what I said before, you can't command interest. And so the problem I have with these papers is that I'm not interested. I don't find them fun to read because maybe they're great tables of great data, but I don't find looking at tables of data fun. So because I don't feel like I'm learning anything from them. So that's the problem I have. So I'd rather do, but again, like I think they're necessary though. I mean, for many applications, and people who do drug design need to be able to do high throughput prediction of affinities and something. So I'm not claiming they're not.
Yeah, perhaps if they do something like ablation in the sense of removing parts of the pipeline, right? And showing that, okay, this part of the pipeline really, really changes the result. That's interesting. Yeah. But just seeing, I agree that just seeing a bunch of numbers, but I think mean average error is like, yeah, nice.
I mean, I think it's also a different field. I think I'm a physical chemist by training. So when I do these things, I like to see some physical chemistry happening. And to me, that's really looking at molecular interactions in detail and with my own eyes. Mm-hmm. So that's why I always go back to VMT. Whenever I have students working with me and learning how to do these quantitative predictions, my first instruction to them and my last one, it's something I keep telling them sometimes throughout their PhD because some people just won't learn, is that don't run a simulation and look at a free energy value or free energy surface or quantitative prediction that came out of a simulation without first loading up that simulation into VMD and checking with your own eyes what's happening in there. Because sometimes you can get very interesting quantities and then you're not realizing that something's happening in simulation that's completely different from what you expected. And so you're not looking at what you think you're looking at. So I really try to get my students to learn that, to first, again, get a sense of what's happening qualitatively and make sure that it's really what they expect before looking at the numbers.
Yeah, we always want to know why. And some people always ask, why do we want to know why? But I think
that's the thing.
Question of character.
Yeah. But I want to feed my intuition with something, right? And numbers only go so far. But for example, you could be computing these ligand binding for energies. And in the meantime, the ligand could be exploring a different binding pose that you didn't expect. And so you're quantifying something, but it's not what you thought you were. Or maybe, I don't know, or maybe something is happening with water molecules in the side, as you said. Maybe there's a counter ion dropping by, who knows? So many things can happen. So that brings us back to the question of sampling in these alchemical simulations. And so for by far the most common way of sampling these, so you have this alchemical parameter, usually between 0 and 1, that connects two different states with different potential energy functions. And typically we discretize this and we fix this parameter at intermediate values and we run simulations at intermediate values. And that's what I'm trying to move away from now, this discretization, and to keep this continuous and dynamical. And one benefit of this, there's several benefits. One of them is you don't have to pick a particular discretization, which has been a headache in the past because it's really hard to find a good rationale on, what is the best discretization of this lambda space. And the second part is the dynamics in lambda is coupled, very tightly coupled to the dynamics of other degrees of freedom. So if you let that freely fluctuating and diffusing, then you're less likely to have metastability in other degrees of freedom. Or maybe you have these orthogonal barriers, but if you have a dynamical lambda, you can just go around the barrier instead of having to cross it. Because the orthogonal barriers are themselves dependent on the value of lambda. And that's something that was my main issue with umbrella sampling from the very beginning. In umbrella sampling, because you're localizing the coordinate you're interested in, you're also making many other tightly coupled coordinates more metastable. And so you're really preventing them from sampling anything, which is why I've always objected to this word of umbrella sampling, because I think umbrella sampling is really like not sampling very much, at least the way it's typically done, you know. And so at some point, a student asked me not long ago why it was that umbrella sampling was so popular. And to that, I said, well, maybe it's so popular in the same sense that a TikTok influencer might be popular. It doesn't mean that they're particularly good at anything in particular.
Right. It's just as we said before, it will always give you an answer, right? And that's a nice feature for someone who just wants an answer.
And there, you know, it's been around forever. There's a lot of exposure, and it's also there is nothing really complicated conceptually about it. So there was also one of the benefits of metadynamics early on is that metadynamics is very easy to understand as principle. So it's easier to, to trust, I think, a method that
right. And just explicitly making the connection, because we haven't mentioned that, well, the standard methods are probably the most explicit method of calculating free energies, alchemical free energies, right? It's pretty similar to umbrella sampling because it's just sampling the derivative of lambda.
Exactly, yes.
At different discrete points.
Exactly. So you're fixing lambda and computing the derivative. That's right. Or maybe either derivative or computing the final differences between adjacent points. That's if you're doing something like M bar. But anyway, it's related.
Yeah, and then there's also this fast switching method, which is based on Crookes theorem.
Yeah.
Which is another alternative. Again, we have like 3 strong methods that can compete for.
Yeah, and that's interesting.
And have their own strengths and weaknesses.
Absolutely. It's funny because recently I've gotten interested again in these non-equilibrium switching methods. I think they have a lot going for them, which is interesting because all the work I did on ABF was all about being as close to equilibrium as possible and, not inputting arbitrary work into the system to minimize bias. But I think if you do non-equilibrium switching well, you can sample a lot of diversity in the trajectories you see. So that's something I've seen with this method called ABMD, adiabatic bias MD, which is also known as ratchet MD or ratchet and Paul MD. So basically it's this method where you have a single progress coordinate and you let it diffuse forward, but you have this harmonic potential that follows it and prevents it from going backward ever. So what's clever about it is that you do get pretty rapid reactive trajectories, but you're exploiting the system's own fluctuations, thermal fluctuations. And so you're not directly...
It's very little work.
Right. And you're not directly imposing the time scale on which transitions happen. So if you do conventional like steered MD, then you pick a time scale and all your transitions will happen more or less on the same time scale. I mean, you might get a bit more lag in some trajectories than others. But when you do this ABMD dynamics, when you have a barrier, you will see crossing times that are very, very different. And these different crossing times will correspond to different pathways. So you get a nice exploration of many pathways in a short time. So I think that's promising.
Oh yeah, I can see. I mean, from my experience, the more work you put, the harder it is to get overlap between distributions of work. That's exactly. I think it was the biggest concern that I have seen in those fast switching simulations.
Absolutely.
So maybe that's something to explore. You're right.
No.
But again, going back to this question of human learning, I like the idea that we want to learn from every experience because, if you think about the way Feynman was approaching science, right? He was reading the title of a paper and trying to guess the conclusion And I think we all have this, we all try to get trained in this approach where like, we look at the project, we try to guess what's happening. And then if we don't see what we guess should be happening, we're really, really interested in that, right? And as you say, this visual inspection and all these visualization tools are really helping with that because it's a long, long journey from an undergrad who's doing their first steps to someone who can really, really look at the system and predict what's going to happen in this particular scenario.
Absolutely.
So yeah, we should invest in human learning in parallel to machine learning.
And it really, as
I agree there.
You know, as I grow older, I find more and more. Sometimes, you know, I find that the most rewarding part of the work is mentoring young scientists. At some point, you know, it's really part of I don't know, helping people grow. Yeah, I find that very rewarding. And you know, helping computers get better numbers is fun, but you get tired of it eventually.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you so much for the conversation, Jérôme Hénin.
Great pleasure.
I appreciate your time and your expertise and the insights. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
And have a great day.
You too.
Thank you for listening. See you in the next episode of Space Invaders.